Let's go and find out what yesterday's budget was. I got to be honest with you, I looked at the headlines. I did what most people do. Is there anything there that affects me? I think it affects my children a little bit to do with the university, but not in a big way. At least they're having their fees that they have to pay to Auckland University cap next year, so I'm not upset about that. And if they then decide to abandon their studies, or Theo decides, I don't want to work, Dad, he won't be getting an unemployment benefit. It'll be income tested as to who I am, which means that I'll have to look after him for the next 2 years. So I wasn't betting on that. I must make sure he gets a job. All right, but telling us what happened yesterday in his budget, the big picture, what it all really means for the country. Who's right, the Taxpayers Union or the Labor Party? The expert economic and fiscal commentator, hugely experienced in budgets and their, I guess, effect. Craig Stobo joins us now. Craig, great to have you on, mate. Lovely to talk to you again.
Yeah. Good morning, Michael. How are you?
Good, mate. Okay. The thing that I was interested in personally yesterday was that number to do with pay equity. And what was it, $13.7 billion. And we know that Labor then hammered the government in the House yesterday over the fact that they were putting together a budget that essentially penalised every woman in this country. I mean, that was the rhetoric. But it's still a budget, isn't it, Craig, that we've got to borrow a crap load of money for, and we'll be still paying back into the future. Have I got that right or wrong?
Yeah, I think that's the drift that I've got, Michael, as well. So I'm sort of trying to think of a strap line for the discussion with you this morning, which is to describe the budget. And I think the line I come up with was the Minister of Finance is trying to hold the line. You can imagine putting your finger in a hole in a dike in the Netherlands or trying to stop the tide coming in. That's the kind of feeling that you have. And I'll just give you the reasons why I think that's the way to think about this. So the backdrop is now weaker growth. So the Treasury's downgraded our growth outlook for next year, partly tariffs, partly other things. The fiscal deficit is expected to deteriorate this year from 2.3% of GDP to 2.6% next year. So it's going to get worse. And while there's a promise in there that we're going to balance the budget by 2028-29, you might recall they changed the definitions of what the deficit is now to exclude ACC. If you include ACC, we're always in deficit into the foreseeable future. So that's really important to understand that. So we've got a structural deficit in our accounts, which means that no matter if we get back to reasonable growth, we'll always have a deficit. And one of the reasons for that is New Zealand's superannuation, which is going to rise from $23 billion today to almost $29 billion at the end of this forecast horizon. It doesn't matter what the economy does, you're going to have to keep paying those amounts to people over 65, and that's a massive drag on expenditure. So what that means is our core Crown debt net rises from 43% to 46% of GDP, which is no change to what you and I spoke about over the last 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
And our interest bill is, around about $9 billion. Despite that backdrop, we're kind of shouting from the rooftops that we're doing a good job by only spending an additional new amount of $1.3 billion this year. But in the numbers the Treasury pumped out, that goes back to new spending next year of $2.4 billion for the next 3 years. And you think, with that backdrop, wouldn't you be trying to get our net spending back to zero? So that's the first point. The second one is they are kind of proud that we've got only new net capex, capital expenditure of $4 billion. And, Nelson Hospital, Wellington Hospital, Defence Force, all worthy causes, but it's still new spending.
Yeah.
And so you've got this kind of wave coming at us, trying to hold the dike and the holes in the dike with our fingers, but it's inexorable coming at us. There's some good things that were in there yesterday, I thought, which are good thematics for us to think about the way this government may be thinking about the next 12 months. The role of private investment is a one way out of out of this hole is to get the private sector humming, and that 20% of new equipment, plant and equipment that you can use to get a tax break is going to cost us $1.7 billion, but give us growth if the private sector is confident and buys new plant and equipment and deepens our capital stock to increase production and wages that go with that. So that's a good thing, but it needs confidence in the private sector. I think stopping the future blowout that you mentioned, the pay equity claims, the number's $13 billion, and I can't tell you how they calculated that because, of course, it's future expenditure that would arise if the claims were successful. So you had to make an estimate of how much that's worth, and it's $13 billion that potentially we won't have to fund from the government accounts. So I think that's impressive. You can argue about the number, but stopping that future drain is really important. And there's a lot of work going on under the hood around small bits and pieces here to try and contain current expenditure. You mentioned Radio New Zealand, $18 billion cut over 4 years. So they've got a reduced funding cap, so they've got to find savings somewhere from within their organisation. But that's sort of going all around the public service right now as we speak. I think the third thematic is moving away from public saving for us to increasing private savings. So reducing that government contribution of over $500 to $250 for KiwiSaver. We spoke about that last week as being a potential outcome from the budget. And furthermore, increasing the contribution rate from 3 to 4% over time for employers and employees. And there's opt-out provisions, but it's a very strong signal that the government wants employers and employees to contribute more to their own savings, not the government doing that. And the last thematic, I think, is means testing. You mentioned your son around
18 and 19-year-olds, yeah.
Yeah, means testing coming in, but it's also means testing for KiwiSaver. So if you earn more than $180,000, you don't get that $250 contribution from the Crown.
You don't need it, do you, really?
Well, that's right. And then best start. So for kids, the kids that are born from 1 June or where the starting date is, the eligibility for that will only apply if you earn less than $100,000. So there's a thematic coming through of means testing, which I think is directionally the way they're going to think about future problems. So after all of that, big picture, you say to yourself, well, can we really say we're doing a good job? And I kind of think we're not going hard enough. And I'll say
just
why.
on means testing, Craig, I mean, those are timid steps at the end of the day.
They
You're
are.
right.
They
And as you say, I'm just looking at superannuation, for example, and the cost of that blowing out as well. I'm getting the feeling from yesterday that Nicola Willis is hemmed in to a certain extent, well, by the coalition agreements that she's reached to be in power and to be in the position where she's delivering a budget in the first place. But it's not just that, is it? Her problem is that the set of public expectations about funding as a consequence of the pump being primed over the last 5 or 6 years means that people just scream because money that they have and they never think about where it comes from. If it does get turned off, then it comes to a point where you've got rid of, aren't you? And that's what she's also fighting against, political electability.
Yep. And so as a consequence, what I've just described, there will be continued focus on reductions in government expenditure because they've got no choice. They have to keep going. And so we'll have more, to use your words, screaming. But the public should be well aware by now that circumstances have changed since the punch bowl party of 2020 to 2023. That's gone, but the hangover is a shocker. So we should expect and encourage more cuts in expenditure. And I'll tell you why. There's a very simple lesson around debt metrics. If our GDP growth rate is higher than our interest rate on our government debt, then we can afford a small deficit and not change the debt profile. It's quite an important thing to understand. If our GDP growth rate is less than interest rate on our debt, and we run deficits, the debt spirals out of control. So we've got a structural deficit today that we're aware of.
Yeah.
And our interest rate on our government debt, 10-year bonds, about 4.7, 4.8%. If our growth rate does not improve above that number and we keep running these structural deficits, we have a debt problem that's going to go beyond the government's mandated cap of 50% of GDP. It'll just blow through that. And
Can
so
I ask a
they
question of
have
you
no.
though, just on that? I've seen a lot of, and we've just talked about it, but you've given us the sort of big picture, and I haven't seen a lot of
Yep,
the big picture in the reporting of this budget, to be honest with you. You know,
that's right.
I've seen a lot of the small stuff, and there's the
Yep,
pay equity and Heritage New Zealand and
yep,
cuts to charter
sure.
school, blah 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 blah. But you made the assumption that New Zealanders will understand, I guess, that we're having to do all this because of. Do we really? Because I'm not seeing the media pick that up to the way that I thought they might have, Craig. Even
Yeah,
some of the stuff that you're talking this morning.
yeah, there's a lot of commentary in the weeds depending on where your kind of audience is. The banks are looking at the bond borrowing program, the accountancy firms are looking at the tax breaks. People in the public service will be looking at their baseline funding issues. Radio New Zealand will be discussing what they do about the reduction in their cuts. So it's all that in the weed stuff. But you pick it right up to the big picture. Think of yourself as a Secretary of the Treasury, Ian Rennie, who's got to advise the government on the fiscal situation. And the big picture advice will sit in behind the numbers and the speeches yesterday around debt dynamics and unsustainable programs. So there was a warning from S&P, I think, out in the last 24 hours. You should listen to the credit rating agencies
Mm,
and around
mm,
what they think. There's no danger
mm.
to our credit rating today, but they're watching. And this budget doesn't really address the deterioration in the fiscal numbers by choice, by the way, because Nicola, although we reduced um, the new spending from 2.4 billion to 1.3 and give herself a pat in the back, but she should have gone harder. They're watching that sort of stuff. So the pathway we're on to continue to put our fingers in the holes in the dike is going.